When my mother and I and two others were studying creative writing under Michael Duncan in 2005, the five of us drafted a book of children's poetry called Floppy Woppy Who's It, to be published under our collective pseudonym, The Writer's Workshop. As head of the workshop, Mr. D asked each of us to submit our personal biographies, which would be condensed along with his own into a 2-page spread as an introduction to the book. Our original submissions were longer, and I'd like to read you excerpts from my mother's. Now, all the biographies were written in the third person, each of us as a ghostwriter on his or her own behalf. So what I'm quoting is what my mother literally wrote word for word herself about herself. Quote, Louise Laser was born in Virden, Manitoba on February the 22nd, 1921. She seemed destined from birth to have a unique lifestyle. When she left the hospital, she carried the name of both the matron and the head nurse as her own at their request. Next paragraph. A quiet, retiring child, she burst out of her shell with her first dance lesson at 9 years and never looked back. She taught her first student at 12 years, and at 16 years she choreographed, costumed, and directed a full evening's dance show, her students as the dancers. That would have been in about 1937. Continuing, quote, later, after a summer's barnstorming with the Winnipeg concert group, she moved to Winnipeg, where she studied for a year, polishing her tap dance skills. Entertaining in military centers was part of her war effort, end quote. Now, chronologically, I'm guessing A, the barnstorming session was the very next summer, 1938. B, it was conducted by two ladies named Gwyneth Lloyd and Betty Hay Farrelly, who had just emigrated that same year from England to scout for talent to form a new ballet troupe in the area. And C, my mother had shown so much promise that Madame Farrelly took her on as her student and taught her to tap dance. So by the time World War II began in September of 1939, she'd have had that whole year's training with which to entertain our soldiers on leave. Continuing, quote, she then joined the Winnipeg Ballet as a student and soon was a company member and teacher. Time out. The Royal Winnipeg Ballet is currently one of the premier professional dance groups in the world that tours all over the world and that often guest stars the world's most renowned dancers. So when you read Winnipeg Ballet in my mother's biography, set in the context of all she'd accomplished prior to joining them, you might conclude she was destined for international celebrity status, with her name in bright neon lights, alongside those of Margot Fonteyn and Anna Pavlova, going on world tours, dancing in lead roles like Claire in Tchaikovsky's Nutcracker, partnering with George Balanchine or Rudolf Nureyev. But let's do a reality check. Royal Winnipeg hadn't always been the professional group it is now. It was started in 1939 as an amateur company, scraping for whatever local amateur talent it could find, and scraping also for whatever local business sponsorship, corporate and personal donations, etc., would keep it afloat from season to season, or even from production to production. And it wasn't easy. My mother became a permanent company member in 1942, and she'll tell you that Gwyneth Lloyd knew how to make the proverbial honey out of horse manure. In 1947, the company sought to compete internationally in Copenhagen in Denmark. And even though they didn't raise enough funds to actually make the trip, what amount did come in proved to be a blessing in disguise, because their financial situation stabilized, they paid off their debts, and accumulated a modest savings in the bank. In 1949, the company turned professional and began to pay its dancers. And in 1953, Queen Elizabeth chartered the company as the Royal Winnipeg Ballet. And as they say, the rest is history. But my mother was not part of that history. Why not? What happened? She continues to write that at age 30 she married and moved to Victoria, BC, and quote, where she continued to teach ballet both privately and for the YWCA. Caring for her increasing family slowed her dance activities considerably. 12 years later, the family moved to Vancouver. At this time, she retired from the dance world in order to finish rearing her children. Now, marriage and family life is a very convincing alibi, so you get the impression from reading that far that Louise Nuns was the popular prom queen type of girl whom everyone loved and adored, but she was humble enough to sacrifice the glitz and the glamour to become a loving wife, mother, and homemaker. And when this gorgeous stud named Stanley Paul Laser swept her off her feet and rode off with her into the sunset, they missed her so. And amidst the tears and the promises that she and the company members would keep in touch, the fond memories of her all too brief sojourn among them would forever remain indelibly in their hearts. Anyhow, Royal Winnipeg went on to become a dominant professional ballet company across Canada, with some of its former dancers moving across the 4 western provinces, particularly, to start their own schools and touring companies. And even since the founding of Ballet BC in 1986, Royal Winnipeg has still been prominent in Vancouver's dance community and still comes out here regularly. But their next visit, I recall my mother ever attending, was not until 2011, 64 years after she last performed with them herself. And she didn't even pay her own passage. My elder brother Robert Wayne Laser, whom I call Bob, and his wife Sue took her as a present for her 90th birthday, and they did so expecting in good faith, as much as I expected, as much as anyone would expect, that those fond memories from the 1940s that I spoke of would be rekindled. But I have strong reason to believe she only accepted their offer because she was too polite to offend them by turning it down. Otherwise, she'd never have gone on her own. Because a few weeks later, during one of the last times my mother and I were on speaking terms, she related to me a conversation she had had with a former associate backstage after that performance, in which they'd agreed to, quote, let bygones be bygones. I find that language very intriguing because, after all, the term bygones is always used to refer to bad memories, not good ones, when you want to forget, not remember. And if you've ever mutually agreed with another person to let them go, those bygones are likely memories of a disagreement you had with that person. That disagreement might have led to anything from a snub at a dinner party at one end of the spectrum to a civil lawsuit or even bloodshed at the other end. But however far that disagreement may or may not have been acted out, the end result is the same. Hurt feelings, anger, bitterness, resentment, hatred, and a repressed yet inwardly smoldering and unquenchable desire for revenge. Now, I don't know how far it was acted out between my mother and that former colleague, but that disagreement must have been a rather serious one if they had to make a conscious effort to mutually agree to let it go after 64 years. So it's pretty obvious that my mother's departure was far from amicable, that the root cause of the disagreement was that she would never have left them on her own, that she wanted to stay with the company and grow with the company, but she wanted that on her terms, not theirs, and they wouldn't accept that. And ever since then, she's fabricated this legend of herself as the greatest ballerina the world never had, as Royal Winnipeg's lost, for which marriage and family life would be nothing more than a convenient alibi. Coupled with that, my 4 elder siblings and I have all heard her more than once accuse our father of just wanting to build his real estate empire. We've heard her accuse him of looking down on his children as excess baggage that threatened to interfere with his real estate ambitions, as seeing us as nothing more than a burden on him. And yet, almost in the same breath, we've also heard her complain that throughout our growing up years, while we were under her care, we were a burden on her. I even recall her making that statement point blank to my sister Lynn and me, and then bragging that she was a survivor. Now, despite her talking out of both sides of her mouth like that, one thing is obvious. She was not happy with married life. It was not what she'd initially romanticized it should be. It was just a short-term fix by which she ended up trading one set of problems in her life for another. I've asked my mother point blank in the past why she married my father. If you ask your mom that question, you should expect her immediate first response, if not her only response, to be that she'd fallen in love with him, that she wanted to spend the rest of her life with him, that they might pool their common talents to make the world a better place to live for their children, for their grandchildren, and so on. My mother didn't say any of that. What she did say was something like, well, he seemed like a nice guy, and of course my dad held out the promise of a new life in Vancouver. He was familiar with the city. We had a brief period of conscription in Canada from the summer of 1943 until the end of World War II, during which my dad had been stationed at CFB Jericho and deployed to man concrete gut emplacement towers up in the northern Gulf Islands. My mom's excuse to go with him to Vancouver was to escape from the influence of her mother, whom we called Grandma Nuns. And she felt she couldn't marry any of the men in the ballet because she thought they were gay, which of course carried a far more negative social stigma back in the 1940s and 50s than what it does today. So she admitted theirs was a whirlwind courtship. Now, aside from the obvious glaring lack of any mention that she loved him, there was another problem as well. My mother told me her last performance with the Winnipeg Ballet was in 1947. So she wouldn't have had any contact with those men, gay or straight, after then. Yet she didn't marry my dad until September 1951. Whirlwind courtships do not last for 4 years. So it's obvious that her departure had nothing whatsoever to do with marriage and family life, because at the time my parents probably hadn't even met. Otherwise, if they had, assuming my mom's complaints about the marriage were justified, they should never have married. So, to make a long story short, there were just too many things she told me that just didn't add up. So, I decided to do some investigating of my own. And I have a number of people to thank for the information I've been able to obtain. In Toronto, Amy Bowering, Director of Collections and Research, and Cindy Brett, her archives associate, and their staff at Dance Canada Dance on Church Street. And in Winnipeg, Gina Borum and her research crew with the Royal Winnipeg Ballet Alumni Association. I sent an email to DCD requesting scans of published programs for all the Winnipeg Ballet productions in which my mother performed. And she sent me a comprehensive list which you see scrolling upon your screen. Now, I specifically requested complete program notes because I wanted to get a feel for how the organization was managed at the time, what was performed, who were the donors and sponsors, what was the target demographic, etc. I wanted to compare that with what I'd learned of the same about Royal City Musical Theatre right here in New Westminster, BC, in which I myself performed 11 productions over a 10-year period from 1995 to 2004, not on stage but playing violin down the pit. And I did discover there were striking similarities. Coupled with that, I also purchased this book from Amazon.com titled Dancing Through Time by Christopher Defoe, which chronicles the Winnipeg Ballet's early years. It was published in 1991. It's concise, it's beautifully illustrated. And the complete program notes I've been able to purchase certainly brought this to life. But there's something very strange about this book. My mother is not in any of the illustrations. Her name does not appear in any of the captions or in the body text from beginning to end. In fact, the only place she's named in the entire book is on page 152 in the second appendix, which lists all the dancers that have come and gone, and which she's chronicled as having left in 1948, 1 year later. Why that 1 year discrepancy? From my own experience, I've always associated the date you depart a performing group as the date of the last show you perform with them, barring some extenuating circumstance. Now, was there an extenuating circumstance in this case? The Winnipeg Ballet did introduce one new dance in 1948. It was called Allegory. And in all fairness, that last conversation I'd had with my mother was after she just turned 90 years old, and by the time most people make it to 90, their memories have begun to fail. So In order to defer to my mother, as public sentiment would dictate of me, I was faced with the choice between A and B. A, Amy Bowring and her staff at DCD had been negligent by not including a copy of the program notes for Allegory as per my original request. Or B, they simply didn't have a copy, because libraries are dependent on their material being donated by those with a vested interest in their cause. In DCD's case, that includes several professional dance companies across Canada. And specifically, in the case of Royal Winnipeg, that material is at somewhat more of a premium due to a fire that had gutted their corporate head office in 1954 and destroyed not only old program notes, but just about everything else: costumes, props, set designs, choreographic scores, business records, you name it. And they had to rebuild from scratch. I sincerely wanted our family to have a copy of the last show our mother performed in. So, I decided the most polite thing to do was to write back to DCD simply requesting a copy of the program notes for Allegory. And the response was neither A nor B. It was C. They had a copy all right. I purchased it and looked through it, and just as Cindy Brett advised me, the name Louise Nuns is nowhere to be found. Their one production in the final year my mother is supposed to have been with them, she did not perform. Now from there, the plot begins to thicken, because although Allegory was premiered as a new ballet in that production, it wasn't the only one that was performed. The company's repertoire up until then, and for some time afterward, was made up of dances from 5-minute shorts up to ballets in some rare cases of almost an hour, all choreographed by Gwyneth Lloyd herself. And what made Gwyneth Lloyd unique as a choreographer is that while most choreographers set to ballet stories that other people written, she wrote her own. She's credited with having written a total of 36 between the years 1939 and 1952, and she tailored them to suit her audiences. 2 examples were the ballets Grain and Kilowatt Magic, which were vignettes about life in the Canadian prairies. So, as was typical of the Winnipeg Ballet's productions during that time, there were 6 other ballets performed in that one 1948 production, in addition to Allegory. My mother had danced in 3 of those 6 previously, and of those 3, I'd like to focus in on one in particular. It was called Object Matrimony. And the reason I'm zeroing in on Object Matrimony is that in the other 2, which were Pleasure Cruise and Finishing School, as well as in about a half dozen others she danced in throughout the 1940s, which were not in that 1948 production, her name appears as one in a group or a pas de corps of anywhere from 2 up to a dozen or so dancers, collectively named the Schoolgirls, the Blanchettes, the Scrub-It-Up Ladies, and so on. Object Matrimony was the one and only ballet my mother performed in which she was cast in the role of an individually named solo character when it was premiered the previous year, March of 1947, and then repeated 2 months later. The character's name was Mary King. But then you'll notice Gwyneth Lloyd rewrote Object Matrimony, which she had not only the ability but also the license to do because it was her story and she could do whatever she wanted with it. She rewrote it to eliminate the role of Mary King from the 1948 production, and there wasn't anything my mother could do about it. So continuing with my mother's biography, quote, widowed at 54, she turned all her attention to giving extra support to the 2 children still with her. They were both musical, one at a genius level. She spent 15 years as a dedicated and energetic director of the Delta Symphony Society, sponsor of the Delta Youth Orchestra, of which her children were members. End quote. Now I want to come back to that paragraph a little later, but continuing for now, quote, later she studied ballroom dance and at age 67 entered a dance competition against all ages. She received the top student mark and a special award. Next paragraph. Her 80th year brought the study of drama. She also joined a senior stage jazz dance group called the Golden Girls and Brian. Another Brian, not myself. This group performs frequently at various events and also enters dance competitions where it is very well received. Louise continues to stretch and exercise regularly with an eye to once more doing ballet, end quote. And then the last two paragraphs go on to talk about her studies under Michael Duncan, including painting watercolors and creative writing, which is more relevant to the book, so I don't need to read any further. But she won this award in an open ballroom dance category in 1988, after a hiatus of not dancing in public for exactly 40 years. And I've watched my mother perform several times during the 1990s and 2000s, and give her credit where it's due. She's been able to burn at the dance floor better than probably most people half her age. What does that tell me? There would have been no shame whatsoever in my mother's having left the Winnipeg Ballet in 1948 due to not having been a good enough dancer, because, well, after all, we can't be the best at one thing. I'm the proverbial two left feet myself. But the fact of the matter is, she was plenty good enough. She was, if not the best, certainly one of the best. So that tells me two things. First of all, her departure had nothing to do with a lack of skill level. And secondly, conversely, nor did it have to do with the companies being in such desperate financial straits that any other factor about Louise Nuns meant casting her would put the company at risk of going bankrupt. That just doesn't wash with me. Yes, the company did struggle up until 1947, often severely. But common sense tells you, if you manage a performing group, you stage your best performers because they're the ones that bring back the repeat audiences. And for 6 years, from 1942 to 47, my mother was a regular permanent fixture. But by 1948, the company's finances, as I said earlier, had begun to stabilize. And it was then that she was gone. Now, you'd think that because 1 year should have been long enough for any dust to settle, my mother could have re-auditioned in 1949 when the group turned professional. And, based on her skill level, she should have been hired immediately. But she wasn't. The only complaint I remember my mother ever having against anyone associated with the company was when she described Gwyneth Lloyd as some sort of an old-school slave driver. But in 1950, Gwyneth Lloyd moved to Toronto to start a ballet school. So any sort of factor Madame Lloyd might have been in the decision to refuse to take my mother back would have been removed as well. My mother liked Betty Farrelly, who was her dance instructor, and who remained with Royal Winnipeg until 1957. And yet, assuming she auditioned for a third time in 1950 after Gwyneth Lloyd had left, Winnipeg still didn't take my mother back. Now, if getting away from Grandma Nuns was such an issue, my mother still didn't have to sacrifice a career in ballet for it, because she did have another option the following year. The National Ballet of Canada was started in 1951 in Toronto. And if you look at a map of Canada, you'll notice that the cities of Toronto and Vancouver are approximately the same air distance, about 1,700 kilometers away from Winnipeg, except in opposite directions. Vancouver's west and Toronto's east. National's hiring process was intended to be far more open than Winnipeg's had been, in that they hired not just local talent, but talent from across Canada and around the world. And it's for that reason that they declined Gwyneth Lloyd as their first artistic director in favor of Celia Franca. Now, because Gwyneth Lloyd's was a big-ticket name, in order to get off the ground, they hired her as merely a resident choreographer, just so her name could be on their program notes. But she would have had no say in the process of hiring the dancers, so there should have been nothing for my mother to worry about from her. Now, probably by this time my father would have entered the picture, and that whirlwind courtship would have begun. The excuse my mother gave me for fleeing to Vancouver was that Grandma Nuns didn't like my dad, that she intended to intervene to prevent them from marrying. Unfortunately, my dad did have serious emotional and psychological issues which came out after the fact, so Grandma Nuns' concerns were justified. At the same time, she told me her mother wanted her to pursue a professional ballet career, and I know that's what my mom wanted herself. So clearly, Grandma Nuns' disapproval of the marriage was a peripheral my mom was using to skirt the real issue. No matter how good a dancer she was not wanted within the ballet community either in Winnipeg or in Toronto, for reasons she did not want her mother to know about. By the early 1970s, the marriage had seriously tanked. My dad was overdosing on barbiturate prescription tranquilizers in order to get high, and then washing them down with about 5 or 6 cups of coffee so he could stay awake and enjoy his highs. And on his come-downs, he could be very verbally abusive. Now, assuming my mother would have had the support of Canada-wide contacts in the ballet community who would be more than happy to help her get re-established among them, perhaps by having her perform or teach in exchange for providing babysitters for the 5 of us, or by any other means they could, she could have given them the ultimatum, you've got 24 hours to seek professional help, or I'm divorcing you. And if it came to the latter, the door might have opened for her to capture the attention of the media and become the celebrity ballerina after all. But she didn't have any such support that I knew about. Stanley Paul Laser died in 1975. And as our mom professed to my sister Lynn and me, he had left her with a net worth of about $150,000 in the form of cash and peripheral real estate throughout the province of BC. So she could well have afforded to get re-established in a ballet career on her own, provided the contacts were there for her. But apparently they still wanted nothing to do with her. So it would be another 11 years until 1986 when she would finally get back into dancing again, more specifically into ballroom dancing, and that with groups of individuals who saw her dance, who knew she'd been a member of the Winnipeg Ballet in its pioneer years, and just on those grounds would swallow an image of her as the greatest ballerina the world never had, because they themselves did not have any affiliation at any time with the Winnipeg Ballet, and so they did not have any reason to suspect what really happened back in 1948. But everything that's happened since should clue you in by process of elimination. A, if my mother was good enough to make the cut as a professional ballet dancer, which she certainly was. B, if she was not somehow an innocent casualty of financial cutbacks. C, if she did not leave the Winnipeg Ballet Club voluntarily back in 1948. Or D, if she did not sustain a long-term injury while rehearsing for the production of Allegory in that same year. Then that leaves only one other option, and that is E. She was fired. There's your extenuating circumstance. Because when you think it through logically, that is by far the most compelling reason anyone in her position could possibly have for holding a grudge, as she did for 63 years, because it's as though they'd said, well, now that we're financially soluble again, get out of here. We don't need you anymore. Why would they do that to one of their best dancers? Now, if you've stayed with me this far, you're probably in good company with a number of armchair novelists, armchair movie producers, maybe even a professional or two at such, who are looking for material for a blockbuster story involving a mother-child relationship. And if for no other reason than that the mother and child in this case happen to be an elderly woman and her middle-aged son, many will see this, again as public sentiment would dictate of me, as my struggle to exonerate my mother, to prove that it was a case of wrongful dismissal. How successfully I'm able to exonerate her will be the subject of part 2 in this series. So stay tuned.